Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the session on sustainable tourism. The tourism industry is argued to be the largest industry in the world, providing more employment than any other industry. Travel and tourism industry is estimated to contribute 10% to the global GDP and generates more than 10% of global employment. Many countries are known to survive and thrive on tourism revenues. However, like other forms of development, tourism can also cause its share of problems such as social issues, loss of cultural heritage, economic dependence, and ecological degradation. As per UNWTO figures, an average of 3 million tourists cross borders every day and about 1.2 billion in a year. It is just the international travel figures. The number will be more than double if travel within each country is counted. The kind of economic activity such a big movement of travelers across the world generates is difficult to calculate to the last penny. Similarly, the kind of adverse impact on the environment that such a movement leaves on destinations is also large and difficult to offset. Tourism is one activity which thrives on natural environment and resources, and what it therefore leaves behind, of course, is a trail of negative footprint. If various reports are anything to go by, resistance against mass tourism and exploitation of local resources like energy, water bodies, etc., have started gaining momentum and from various places in the world, including some of our own cities. Sustainable tourism is a major agenda before global agencies as well as countries of the world today. As the world is under lockdown for some time now due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and each and every economic activity is in a reboot stage now, it is ideal time for travel and tourism sector also to make the necessary corrections from the past and take a sustainable approach forward. To speak in detail about tourism and sustainability, we have with us Mr. C.B. Ramkumar, a practitioner of sustainable living and a champion of sustainable tourism. Mr. Ramkumar dons many hats. He is an author, trainer, consultant, entrepreneur, and an expert in applied sustainability. Known more for his ecotourism venture, My Native Village, a 100% self-sustaining eco-resort in Bengaluru. Mr. Ramkumar is also a board member of the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, GSTC, and its regional director for South Asia. I don't think we can get a better person than him to talk about sustainable travel and tourism. Welcome, Mr. Ramkumar. It is a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Krishna. It's good to be here.
I would like to begin by asking you the most basic question. What was the trigger for Ramkumar, a marketing and advertising expert, to embrace sustainability as a philosophy and way of life and turn into a champion of sustainable living?
Yes, it was a long journey that brought me to embracing sustainability and sustainable tourism. And the trigger point was when I saw instances of what I call man-made destruction and man-made problems in just existential living. When I saw that in rural India, that was the trigger. The land on which I built my resort, which is called Our Native Village, not just My Native Village. The land on which I built my resort is land that we've owned for over 3 decades. And we've seen instances of what I call man-made poverty, where living becomes so difficult because the living depends on resources that are not in our control. Electricity, water, waste management. We've just got so used to outsourcing that to either the government or other civic agencies. Whenever any of those services break down, our life seems to break down, which is what I saw in rural India. While rural India had the innate knowledge for farming, which has come down from generations, where they knew how to farm, even in a drought condition, even in a flood condition, excessive rain condition. All that knowledge of farming was, unfortunately, but successfully removed in perhaps, decades of the Green Revolution. While the Green Revolution by itself was good for the country, it was needed. What it did was it told the farmer Be a modern farmer. Don't depend just on the rain to crop, to raise your crops. Here's a bore well. Everybody was given free bore wells, and they were told, now you can get water whenever you want, not just when the monsoon decides to bless you. So all these farmers decided to put bore wells, and slowly over time, they just lost touch with nature and their innate knowledge on how to work in harmony with nature. And unfortunately, he got dependent on the bore well. And eventually what we did was we pulled the plug and we said, sorry, no electricity. As the population grew, electricity became scarce. At one time, 300 million people in this country didn't have electricity. So what happened was this farmer who got dependent on a resource like electricity from outside suddenly was crippled and he stopped farming. And I saw multiple instances of this around my land, which is when I told myself, we have gone to the extent of putting a man on the moon and we can't find water for our farmer. We need to redefine our notion of progress, is what I told myself. And that's when my quest started to say, how can we live our life without depending on anybody outside to give us the basic comforts of life, like electricity, water, waste management services, architecture, or food chain. So that journey was intensified because I saw this very old couple going through poverty like none of us have ever known. I was in a market where we were all selling our vegetables, and they just sold a few pumpkins and went back home that day with 75 rupees. And they'd walk 6 kilometers to come and sell those pumpkins. And I told myself, they need to wait for another 3 months for more pumpkins to come. How are they going to survive with 75 rupees in their pocket? So that kind of touched a very deep emotional chord in me. And I promised myself that I will build a sustainable model for living. And my resort, Our Native Village, was a staging ground to prove that model. And because the resort was based on completely sustainable platforms, because I wanted to build that model for a 360-degree self-sustaining lifestyle. And so that's a long story on how I gave up my advertising career to get into sustainability.
Just to understand your role in the GSTC, as a board member of the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, how do you assess and evaluate the commitment of the travel tourism sector in India to sustainable tourism practices? What the government boasts of improvement in India's standing in tourism competitiveness index, how does it reflect on commitment on sustainability?
Oh, we are still very, very far away, and it's a long journey before Indian tourism industry as a whole can absorb sustainability as a concept to live by. I've been working in this space for about more than a decade and a half now, and I've been a member of the GSTC since its inception. Now, at the GSTC, which is a standard setting body, a sustainable tourism standard setting body, what we do is we have set standards globally for people to follow. The government of India, at one point in time, actually brought the GSTC to India, and we launched it in 2010. And the whole idea was we will start to bake it into our sustainable tourism policies or into our overall tourism policies. Different steps needed to be taken at that point in time. So the sustainable tourism criteria for India was developed, and I was part of the committee that developed that, where it was said that we need to develop some norms which are India specific, which the GSTC welcomes countries to take the guidelines that we're given and fine tune it to each country, which was done also. That was launched also. A couple of years later, the execution of that launch of that was also launched. But nothing much has happened since then. When I say nothing much has happened, what we would like to see from a GSTC's perspective is sustainable tourism principles, practices, and processes as given in the guidelines by the GSTC is put into the overall tourism policy. Now, sustainable tourism cannot be looked at a separate tourism vertical. It is not, which is the mistake most countries and governments make. All tourism needs to be sustainable. If it is not sustainable, we will have a problem for tourism overall. So people confuse sustainable tourism saying, okay, we will do tourism and then we'll do sustainable tourism. It doesn't work that way. We need to take the guidelines and bake it into the overall standard tourism policy. That is when it will become part of the lives of everybody in tourism. If it is kept as a separate subject, people will decide when they want to adopt it, which is exactly what's happening in India. Like I said, I've been at it for a decade and a half, and not much has happened, I dare to say, in terms of adoption of sustainable tourism. You have anecdotal examples of people, businesses adopting sustainability as part of their DNA, but those are just anecdotal examples. I would safely say that more than 95, 98% of tourism in industry has not got on the sustainability platform, either because they're not aware of it, and it's quite possible, but those who are aware of it have also not bothered too much because, unfortunately, it is a business, and most managers and owners of the business look at it as a quarter by quarter issue. Sustainability needs a little bit of long-term view. And today people are talking about it saying, oh my God, COVID, we all need to look at it. I wish people had looked at it earlier. But as long as people only look at quarter by quarter results, this year, what am I making? Every manager, all that he wants to look at it, how much occupancy am I getting? How much gross margins am I getting? Every owner only wants to look at it saying, how much profits am I making at the end of the year? And because there is no compulsion, nobody looks at it. And that is the unfortunate situation as of now.
Going back to what your answer was, in your earlier answer, you mentioned about you started engaging the government of India, the tourism department, in 2010. The process has started, but we want to know what kind of engagements do agencies like GSTC have with the government's policymakers and with the industry to make tourism activities really responsible and sustainable in the long term? How do you make that activity, that engagement, a continuous process?
We are a standard setting body, like I said in the beginning, which was, given birth by the United Nations system. What we can do for governments is give them the global standards. After that, we hope that governments will adopt them because at the end of the day, like you said in the introduction, tourism is a huge contributor to GDP and to employment. And what we tell governments is, as long as you adopt sustainable tourism principles, your tourism sector will be sustainable. But it also requires an enlightened person on the other end to understand this and look at it from a long-term perspective. Now, as GSTC, we cannot force any governments to adopt the principles. What we can do is, with all the research that we've done over a decade, all that is available absolutely free of charge to governments. So we don't charge because everything is in the public domain. All the principles that we're talking about are in the public domain. So this is really almost like a gift that we give to the countries because this has been funded by UN agencies and a lot of people all over the world. And with that funding, we were able to arrive after lots of research. What are the basic principles that countries need to follow, that businesses need to follow? Beyond this, GSTC cannot force government. So what we do is we try and engage with them on a constant basis. The challenge also in India is, the bureaucrats who look at sustainable tourism or tourism in general, they move quite fast. Within 3 years, a bureaucrat gets moved out. The joint secretary sort of moves every 3 years, 4 years. So that continuity is a challenge because this is not an imperative. From a GSTC's perspective and from the United Nations perspective, it is an imperative. But unfortunately, governments are not looking at it as an imperative. It seems to be something that, we look at it at some point in time, and there lies the challenge because they're not seeing the urgency of the issue. In spite of India being a signatory to all the United Nations charters, including the climate change charters, this is not being seen as something which is urgent, unfortunately.
And you rightly mentioned about GSTC's role and your role as well in India tourism, adopting sustainable tourism criteria some 5-6 years back. So how are the implementation of the same in terms of industry adopting it? It hasn't happened yet. So what, according to you, need to be done for tourism industry to adopt these guidelines in its letter and spirit? Since you mentioned about the bureaucrats changing and all that. So I want to know whether a legislation is a remedy for the whole thing.
You're right. Quite honestly, when I started on this journey working with governments, I used to always say, yes, a carrot and a stick approach would be good, but we should see first whether industry is willing to adopt sustainability on their own accord, without being forced to do so. But now I can say, after a decade of GSTC in India and more than a decade and a half of me trying to persuade tourism players to become more sustainable, now I'm inclined to think that yes, we need legislation, because it seems that people only respond to legislation. Tourism industry responds very well to the MDA budgets which are there with the government. Everybody immediately does whatever needs to do to ensure that the MDA budget comes your way. They go through all the star certifications and all whatever other compliance is needed so that they can get the MDA budgets, right? So perhaps the time has now come for legislation. Carbon taxation is perhaps something which is necessary. And I always tell tourism practitioners, especially hoteliers, I tell them, right now, everybody is under the radar when it comes to carbon emissions. Government, as part of the climate accord, the France climate accord, all that the government is looking in carbon emissions is for the large sectors, cement, steel, power generation. It's a question of time before the government says, hang on, every hotel is using a diesel generator for their operation, and there are absolutely no norms in terms of whether the AC is running, not running. So it's a question of time before the government says, how much carbon is the hotel segment emitting as a percentage of all industries together? And I think we'll be in for a few surprises. And I strongly believe that a conclusion will be reached where people will say that the value the tourism department or the tourism industry adds to the economy, that will become disproportionate to the resources that the tourism industry consumes. It is published fact that a resident in a hotel, a guest in a hotel or a resort uses 7 to 9 times more water than the residents in that locality. If you take water consumption, waste generation, and energy consumption, I am quite convinced that the resources the tourism industry consumes is disproportionate to the value we add back to the economy. We can still talk about 10% employment, 10% GDP. That's because we have not factored in the disproportionate resource consumption. And I believe that once that is factored in, tourism will not look as rosy as it looks today, and that is when legislation will kick in. But I'm hoping that the government will not need to look at that before legislation kicks in. The time has come now, to answer your question again, that we, I think, need a few laws to govern resource consumption in tourism. And that itself will ensure that tourism practitioners start to adopt sustainability as far as their operations are concerned.
Since you mentioned about the MDA program, I just want to reshuffle my questions a little bit. So that's an interesting angle that you have put in, because the industry is always latch on to such incentives and make corrections in their business to get those kind of assistance. So in that context, I want to know, is incentives is a real solution for it? Incentivize the industry through the government going out and giving some kind of tax holidays or incentives like that to adopt these sustainable practices into their business. Is it a solution for it?
It's not the only solution. Incentives have to come with punitive measures too. I think what the government should do is, okay, right now COVID, everybody in tourism is crying for more stops from the government. So I'm not going to sort of look at that as a specific issue. I'm looking at while COVID is happening, a post-COVID situation, not just incentives along with punitive measures. I say that only because as Indians, we are a very smart race. We can figure out how to ensure that we get incentives, So I believe that incentives has to be balanced with punitive measures if it is not followed. Right now, what happens is, if you do the right thing, you get a tax stop or you get an incentive. But if you do the wrong thing by installing 20 diesel generators when you can actually use solar panel, that is not factored in at all. So some kind of a carbon emission measurement and a carbon emission linked incentive or punitive measure needs to come in, because today sustainability is affordable. The time when I started my resort, in 2006, more than 15 years ago, everything to do with sustainability was expensive. But today it is not the case. Sustainability makes business sense. The only thing that needs to be done is hotel owners, managers need to be persuaded to look into it, which we've tried for more than a decade and a half. And many other people have tried, not just us. Now I believe that they need to be forced to look at it. And when you're forced to look at it, they will also realize that it makes business sense. If it doesn't make business sense, it is different. It makes business sense. We need incentives, but I think we need to couple that with punitive measures, especially when it comes to excess consumption of resources like energy and water and excess generation of waste, as a whole.
You advocate a carrot and stick kind of a model to make it really work on the ground. Right.
I advocate this with a heavy heart.
Okay.
I advocate this truly with a heavy heart because, like I said, there are hundreds of thousands of people whom we've exposed to sustainability over the last decade and a half. After every such interaction, all I get is a pat on my back saying, wow, Mr. Ram, awesome. Yeah, we should do something about it. And then we wait for the next conference. And I think that time is over, So while I say punitive measures, I say this with a heavy heart. I don't have any pleasure in saying this, but I think it's needed now.
My next question is, in the tourism sector, sustainability is understood by different people in different ways. What is happening is largely a greenwashing, in the name of sustainability. So in this context, what is the relevance of global certification and green accreditations in this space to make the consumer really aware of the real commitment of the business towards sustainable agenda, so it's sustainable goals?
Yeah, it plays a very, very important role because that is what gives market access and that is what gives customers some kind of a peg to sift through the greenwashing from the real players. And certifications and all that play a very, very important role. Now, you're right, there is a lot of confusion, sustainability, eco, green. Now, as the United Nations describes it, and which is adopted by the World Tourism Organization also, and that is how it percolated down to the GSTZ, sustainability encompasses economic aspects, social aspects, and environmental aspects. The challenge with a lot of green certifications is, unfortunately, it only addresses environmental aspects. That is not enough. Why? Because sustainable tourism has to also include economic aspects and social aspects. That is when the whole picture feeds into the 2030 global agenda of sustainability that the United Nations has prescribed, which all the countries have signed on to. So sustainability is more than just environmental issues. It is more than just greening. That's the term. It encompasses economic aspects and social aspects. And a lot of people, look at it and say, what do you mean economic aspects? And India is a classic case, where we've had so many resorts that have opened in sensitive zones, in the buffer zones, in forests and all of that. And they have been closed down now. That is because the economic aspect of sustainability was not adhered to. And in economic aspects, we tell people, we ask questions like, are you a registered legal entity? Is the land that you are on a legal entity and does it conform to the local laws of the area? If you just look at that one aspect, you realize that a lot of resorts which are in buffer zones, which are in sensitive zones, do not adhere to it. Until now, they were able to manage and say, okay, you bribe this official, you bribe that official, and you manage to build a resort. But that is not sustainable. All you need is the government which comes and says, hang on, this is against the law and pull the resort down. And it has happened in India. This is why we say the economic aspects of sustainability are so important, because you want your business to run. If you are not following the law, your business will not run. And this is an aspect of sustainability. Similarly, social aspects. You run a resort in a remote location and you bring people from all over India to work in your place and you ignore the local populace. It's a question of time before some enmity will form. Guests will start to be harassed as they come towards the resort because they have to come through the villages. Villages will start to protest because bore wells are being used. All this will result in an interruption of your business. So there's one aspect of your social aspect which you're not taken care of. I'm just giving you a few instances of economic and social aspects that businesses need to factor in, but they need to factor in fully, which is why we have an entire criteria listed for this in fair amount of detail to ensure that your business is sustainable, not just environmentally friendly. You have to be sustainable overall, including environmental friendly.
So you understand that in India, tourism is not a union subject. No, it's a state subject largely. Although we have a central ministry of tourism, I know that there's many tourism policies have come for India, but putting it to the states, no, it has becomes a very big problem because the land is under the states. Whatever activities happen is at the state level, and the state tourism boards are the real policy makers and decision makers, and that change has to come from the states. So in that respect, so do you see any green shoots when it comes to sustainability or responsible tourism from Indian states? Do you think the bodies like GSTZ is somewhere not doing enough to engage the states? No, because that's where the change has to come.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Tourism is a state subject. All that the union government can do is issue guidelines, policy guidelines. That has to be the starting point. I want the union government to issue policy guidelines that are based on sustainability. Once that happens, then the states follow union government tourism policy guidelines. They don't have to necessarily implement it fully, but at least there is the first step that is taken in terms of seriousness towards sustainability. Now, GSTC has spoken to many states in India. Kerala is, of course, a standing example of how they've tried to bake in sustainability into the tourism policy, and by and large, they've done a fantastic job of that. I've spoken to the Tamil Nadu government. I've spoken to the at a very peripheral level to the government in Pondicherry. The Madhya Pradesh government has expressed a very strong inclination towards it. And in fact, on the 24th of March, I was supposed to be in Madhya Pradesh to meet the tourism stakeholders there because they wanted to look at tourism in a more sustainable manner. And of course, COVID broke in. That didn't happen. Now, even for the states to follow it, unfortunately, is again reliant on individual bureaucrats to take it forward. And that is where, policy guidelines themselves, I'm seeing a challenge in issues regarding sustainability, even for the states, because I've spoken to at least 2 or 3 ministers, in Karnataka itself. And the ministers change, or tourism is usually a punishment portfolio for most ministers or most bureaucrats. All of them want other portfolios. So the focus on tourism and it becoming sustainable tourism is a huge challenge. And I'm telling myself that till tourism reaches at least a 15-20% of GDP, the focus on tourism as such, and therefore it becoming more sustainable, I think will continue to remain a challenge. You'll see economies around the world, the moment tourism hits a GDP of 20-25% is when the focus comes on it. And then they say, oh, okay, now we need to do something more and sustainability becomes an issue. So trying to get even states to start conversations and to start implementation is a challenge because they don't see it as an immediate imperative. And there lies the challenge.
There lies the challenge for sustainability. So we want to conclude there's a perception that sustainability is possible only in rural or remote setting and not in an urban reality. It cannot be an urban reality. Similarly, there's also a perception that luxury and sustainability cannot coexist. Today, hopefully, we have been able to debunk many of these myths. The COVID-19 pandemic has, of course, brought global tourism to a grinding halt. There have been numerous reports of positive changes in the natural environment of destinations after countries went into lockdown mode. In that respect, there are lessons that the travel and tourism industry need to learn and take corrective actions to make travel sustainable in the long run. We hope that this session today has provided everyone an insight into how they can all contribute to it and take one small step for man, but a giant leap for sustainability. Thank you, Mr. Ramkumar, for this much needed chat. We couldn't have done it without you. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.